Alarms blared as Natasha finally started to get back to her senses. They were in Stark Tower looking for some weapons. She had come here with Yelena and her baby Cardia, having decided to take her with them because there was nowhere really safe beside her side. Everything had been going well till she couldn't remember, but judging by the rumble around her, something bad had happened. Natasha quickly looked at her arms and found her baby sleeping peacefully, wearing all black and wrapped in a black blanket. "Hey there, little one," she said with a small smile on her face. The sound of alarms momentarily silenced as she was in her own world. Natasha looked around and saw Yelena, quickly as she could with frightening speed and grace in order to not shake her baby. "Yelena," she said quietly, shaking the woman subtly and jumping back when the other woman quickly sprang up with a gun and knife in hand, frantically scanning the room till her eyes landed on Natasha and Cardia. She eased her grip on her weapon a bit. "Is she okay?" Yelena asked frantically as she moved toward the two and frantically checked over the baby. "We're both fine," Natasha said with a small smile. Yelena still checked for herself. "We need to go." The alarms, and then the alarms suddenly went quiet. Natasha knew what that meant. "They're here," she said as she got into a stance with her baby strapped to her front and Yelena in front of them. She had wondered why Tony would have taken so long to head for them, even not sending one of his suits as he had done before. They had disabled surveillance when they got in, so she knew the cameras were deactivated for at least until someone turned them back on. They both waited cautiously, trying to calm themselves as best as they could. The door whirled open and they could hear the mechanical thumping and hydraulics of a machine, and she knew who it was instantly. Tony walked around the corner in his suit. He only gave them a glance as he walked around the room looking at the destruction. "I hope you don't expect me to foot the bill for this," he said as he turned around to face the two. "So I see you got yourself a new guard dog. Is Steve around?" Tony asked, approaching the two with little concern. Yelena kept her guard raised towards the suit's head as he stopped in front of Yelena. "I am no dog," Yelena said with a bite, but Tony wasn't really concerned as he pushed her aside. She fired her weapon at the head of his suit and found herself staring at a glowing unibeam and other weapons after her bullet simply deflected off. Natasha knew she had to calm the tensions because from what she had heard from Steve after their fight, Tony wasn't going to be as easygoing as he used to be, but much harsher and colder. Even when Steve had retold what happened and she could see Bucky clutching his arms in pain, she found it hard to believe that the same Tony, she knew would be so murderous, but by the look on Steve's face she knew there was more to it. Hopefully, he would tell her with time. They all had their secrets. "Keep your dog on a leash," Tony said, his voice still disguised in that unnerving robotic tone. "Hand now," Tony said with his gaze locked on Natasha with his hand still pointed out at Yelena. "American scum," Yelena said as she spat at him and immediately heard the arm charging. Natasha quickly rushed to interfere. "Yelena, hands now," she said, hoping that she understood because she thought the other woman was still underestimating Tony. Seeing the serious and worried look on Natasha's face, Yelena decided to drop it, for now, dropping her gun on the floor and raising her hands. "Who's the kid?" he asked, and although he didn't move, she could tell he was probably trying to look up her baby. "My kid," she said after a small moment of quiet, which seemed to confuse him as he brought down his hand, eliciting a sigh of relief from Yelena. Natasha knew what he wanted to ask, but he could do that later. "I thought you said you would never be able to have kids?" he asked. "Unless..." "No, she's mine. Carried her for 9 months, I don't know how it happened. But I wasn't going to give her up." She knew she didn't have to say any more when Tony raised his hand to silence her. because she could already see the gears turning even if under that suit, because if that was her only shot at ever being pregnant she wasn't going to risk losing her baby. Tony just hummed with his glowing eyes still set on Cardia before he turned and started heading out the door. "Follow me," Tony said, not looking back, and after a moment Natasha started walking after him, quickly throwing a glance at Yelena and nodding at her to follow. They walked around the building for a while till they got to a large room. Natasha was surprised by the changes. She knew from what information she got that Tony worked more in his building by himself than he did before and only occasionally went to the Avengers camp to meet with the others. As they walked into the new giant room, Natasha spotted Tony sitting down in his chair with a few suits standing behind him. Natasha could see the many other suits in the shadows, all of them activate and watching her and Yelena closely. "It was a nice trick that you did with the cameras, but Friday told me you were here." Natasha already knew that Tony would let them steal looking away on purpose. Friday was planning to respond, but there was a disturbance that knocked her offline. "Good trick through." Yelena locked her eyes on Tony and was about to move toward him when Natasha quickly grabbed her shoulder. She was about to protest but turned to see Natasha shaking her head. Yelena sighed and broke off Natasha's hold as Tony descended the stairs. "You have a lot of surprises, Nat. First you betray me, then you pop up in Russia doing something that nearly threatened to start World War III. That surprised Nat as she was sure that they had gone under the radar, but of course, someone like Tony would notice. He was probably still hunting for Bucky and Steve. "It's nice to see that I'm still on your mind since the last time," she said with a small smile that Tony returned. "But where's your boy in blue and his pet project?" Tony asked, his voice becoming more serious. "I honestly couldn't tell you where," she said, trying not to spill anything, but Friday instantly popped up. "She's lying, boss." "I know, Friday, I know," Tony said as he finally got down, sitting on a couch, and waved at them to move closer and sit with him. Cautiously the duo approached the couch opposite Tony, their heads on a constant swivel. "If I wanted to catch or kill you, I would have done it already," Tony said as he reached for a glass of water that was poured by one of his suits. "They make great housemates," Tony said, trying to lighten the mood as Nat and Yelena sat down. Yelena looked fidgety and Nat was calm and unmoving, simply holding Cardia and swinging side to side slowly. "So, breaking into my house, what's up with that? Haven't I let you steal enough already? Even Fury covering for you now kind of sucks." "Well, needed all of that to keep the world in order," Nat replied as she stroked her baby, trying to find a glimpse of something in Tony's eyes. "I think I can do that all on my own," Tony said, stretching out his arms to all of the suits. "Ultron would beg to differ," Nat said with some bite, but it didn't seem to sway Tony. "So who's this straggler?" Tony asked, pointing to Yelena. Nat was about to speak till Yelena interrupted her. "Someone you shouldn't mess with." Natasha just let out a tired sigh as she went to look over Cardia as the two began to exchange insults. This reminded her of when she and Yelena were in a bar after their mission in Russia. Yelena had drunk a lot and started messing with a very large man in the bar. Suffice to say, even if you are a widow doesn't mean someone else can't ragdoll you for a while. Natasha had only stepped in when the guy's friends wanted to jump in after Yelena pulled out a broken bottle, because the last thing they needed then was drawing attention to themselves. "What's got you smiling like that?" Yelena asked. She saw the two had stopped arguing and were looking at her. "Nothing really. So are you two done with your little argument?" she said, receiving a glare from Yelena. "Zoning out now too? That is very unlike you, Nat," Tony said, watching her closely. "I have other things to focus on these days," she said, smiling back down at Cardia. "So what's the kid's name?" Tony asked as he kept glancing at the kid. "Her name is Cardia." "Cardia Romanov, or you can just say Romanov if you want. This was really bugging Tony. He had kept somewhat of a close eye on her and their group as best as he could. The rest had gone dark, only showing up at some locations, and she popped up in Rasane. Was she pregnant that whole time? He really wanted to ask her if it was his from when they had their meetings before everything with Steve kicked off, but he wasn't going to push it for now. So does Cap know? He asked, trying to gauge her reaction, and her face was giving away way too much. This wasn't the Nat he knew. No one else knows besides Yelena. I would prefer it stayed that way for now, she said, the last part eyeing Tony. Come on, Nat, even you know I wouldn't do something like that. I know, Tony, I know. The two just stared at each other for a moment before Yelena interrupted the two with a forced cough that seemed to shake the two out of their stupor. So you're alone here, Stark? Yelena asked, taking a look around. Yes, I am, but do keep your hands to yourself. Try and steal something and it might shoot you, Yelena just grumbled. She knew about Tony Stark. He was very high up on the list of people was once told to capture before she aligned with Natasha. The only thing worth stealing here is you, she said with a sly smile before getting a glove thrown at her. She turned to find Natasha glaring at her. You know I'm just joking, Yelena said quickly. Natasha began to relax. Is my room still the same? Natasha asked, and the nod from Tony was all she needed. Can you get Friday to get me some baby stuff? I'll be in my room, Natasha said as she got up and headed out without waiting for any of them to stop her. Yelena and Tony stared at each other. So where do I sleep? Tony had more questions, but he could ask those tomorrow. Friday, show her to the guest room. Yelena gets up and the screens around the room direct her away. After she left the room, Tony sat in silence trying to organize everything he had just learned. And Friday, be sure to keep an eye on them, but what he was interested in more was Cardia.